Don't come. Having you here is just too much trouble. I understand. I'll cancel my trip.
Ma'am, I'm calling about your son's house. There's something they never told you.
Wait, what did you just say?
I had been looking forward to the visit for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything dramatic. I wasn't moving in. I wasn't asking my son and his wife to rearrange their lives around me. I simply wanted to spend a few days with family, see the home they had talked so much about, share a few meals, and enjoy the kind of ordinary moments that become more precious as you get older. My son had sounded happy when we first discussed it. He told me which dates would work, mentioned a few places we could visit, and even joked about finally letting me judge whether his cooking had improved, so I booked the trip. Then, only days before I was supposed to leave, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice was polite at first, but strangely cold. She told me the visit wasn't going to work after all. I asked if something had happened. Was someone sick? Had work become too busy? Did they need me to change the dates? There was a pause. Then she said the words I would remember for a very long time. Having me there would be too much trouble. For a moment, I honestly didn't know what to say. Too much trouble. I had always tried to be the opposite. Whenever I visited family, I cleaned up after myself. I offered to buy groceries. I never expected anyone to entertain me every minute. I respected closed doors, work schedules, and private time. But she spoke as if my presence would be a burden they had narrowly escaped. I swallowed the embarrassment and told her I understood. What else was I supposed to say? I wasn't going to beg my own family to tolerate me. After the call ended, I sat alone staring at the travel confirmation on my phone. The suitcase I had already started packing was sitting open nearby. Inside were a few clothes, a book, and small gifts I had bought for them. Suddenly, everything looked foolish. I canceled the trip. The cancellation cost me money, but that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing that someone I considered family could reduce me to an inconvenience so easily. My son didn't call that evening. He didn't call the next morning either. That silence told me almost as much as my daughter-in-law's words. I wondered whether he agreed with her. Maybe he had been standing beside her when she called, and maybe they had discussed it together and decided she would be the one to deliver the message. I wanted to call him and demand an explanation. Instead, I stopped myself. If he wanted to explain, he knew my number. For the next few days, I tried to put the situation behind me. Then my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as their landlord. At first, I thought he had the wrong person. Why would my son's landlord be calling me? But he knew my name. And then he asked a question that changed the entire situation. He wanted to talk about the house. There was something my daughter-in-law apparently had not expected me to know. Or perhaps had forgotten completely. My connection to the property was more important than she had allowed herself to believe. The landlord explained the problem carefully. There were questions involving the tenancy, payments, and arrangements connected to the home. Whatever confidence my daughter-in-law had shown while canceling my visit suddenly seemed far less impressive. I listened without interrupting. The irony was almost unbelievable. Days earlier, I had been told that entering that house for a short family visit would be too much trouble. Now the person responsible for the property was calling me, because the people living there had a problem they couldn't simply dismiss. I could have reacted emotionally. Part of me wanted to. I could have called my daughter-in-law immediately and repeated her own words back to her. Sorry. Sounds like too much trouble. But I didn't. Instead, I asked the landlord to explain everything. The more I heard, the clearer the situation became. My son and daughter-in-law were dealing with an issue serious enough that they needed cooperation rather than arrogance. The home they treated as completely theirs existed within agreements and responsibilities that could not be ignored. And now, unexpectedly, I was part of the conversation. Not long afterward, my son finally called. His tone was completely different from the silence of the previous days. He sounded nervous. He asked whether the landlord had contacted me. I said yes. Another pause. Then he began explaining. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said things had become stressful. He said his wife hadn't meant to hurt me. I listened. Then I asked him a simple question. If she didn't mean it, why didn't you call me? He had no good answer. That was the part that mattered most. My daughter-in-law's insult had hurt, but my son's silence had made it worse. Marriage requires loyalty, and I understood that his wife was his partner. I had never expected him to attack her on my behalf. But there is a difference between supporting your spouse and allowing your mother to be treated disrespectfully. He could have called. He could have said, "Mom, things are complicated right now." He could have apologized. Instead, he had disappeared until he needed something. That realization changed me. I told him I would cooperate with anything I was legitimately responsible for, but I would not pretend the cancelled visit had never happened. A few hours later, my daughter-in-law called. This time, there was no confident dismissal in her voice. She tried to explain that she had been overwhelmed. She said preparing for a guest felt stressful. She said the house wasn't ready. She said she had too much going on. I let her finish. Then I reminded her that she could have told me any of those things. If she had said, "I'm exhausted. Could we postpone?" I would have understood. If she had said, "Can you stay at a hotel?" I would have considered it. If she had said, "This month is terrible for us," I would have changed my plans. But she hadn't said any of that. She had called me, "Too much trouble." Those words weren't a scheduling problem. They were a judgment. She became quiet. For the first time, I think she understood why the situation couldn't be repaired with a quick excuse. Then came the request I had been expecting. They needed my help. The details surrounding the house had become difficult, and the landlord's call had forced them to confront the situation. Suddenly, the woman who had decided I was an inconvenience wanted patience, cooperation, and understanding from me. I almost laughed at the contradiction. But revenge wasn't what I wanted. I wanted respect. So I told her I would not use the housing problem to punish them. I would do whatever was fair and reasonable. However, I also made something clear. I would never again arrange my life around an invitation from them, unless I knew I was genuinely welcome. No more buying tickets based on vague promises. No more preparing gifts for people who might cancel me when I became inconvenient. No more pretending cruel words were harmless simply because family had spoken them. She apologized. This time, the apology sounded more sincere. But an apology doesn't instantly rebuild trust. Over the following days, the landlord situation was resolved through conversations, paperwork, and practical decisions. I remained calm throughout it. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't gloat. I didn't use whatever leverage I had to humiliate my son or his wife. That surprised them. I think they expected anger. Instead, I gave them boundaries. And boundaries were much harder to argue with. My son called again after everything settled down. He apologized for staying silent. He admitted he had known about the cancelled visit. He had disagreed with the way his wife handled it, but he didn't want to fight at home, so he convinced himself that saying nothing was the safest choice. I told him silence is still a choice. Avoiding conflict doesn't make the consequences disappear. Sometimes it simply transfers the pain to the person who wasn't allowed into the conversation. He understood. At least I hope he did. Weeks later, they invited me again. This time, the invitation came from both of them. My daughter-in-law told me she wanted a chance to start over. I appreciated that. But I didn't immediately say yes. The old version of me probably would have accepted just to prove there were no hard feelings. The new version of me understood that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can forgive someone without rushing back into the exact situation where they hurt you. You can love family while still requiring respect. You can be kind without volunteering to be treated as disposable. Eventually, I agreed to a shorter visit, but on different terms. I arranged my own accommodation nearby. My son objected at first. He said I could stay with them. I told him I knew. I simply preferred having my own space. That decision changed the entire feeling of the visit. I arrived without anxiety. I wasn't worried about being too much trouble. Because I wasn't dependent on their hospitality. We met for meals, went sightseeing, talked, laughed, and slowly rebuilt something that had nearly been damaged beyond repair. My daughter-in-law was noticeably different. Maybe the landlord's call had humbled her. Maybe my refusal to retaliate had surprised her. Or maybe she finally understood that family relationships are not guaranteed simply because people share a connection. Whatever the reason, she treated me with consideration. On the last evening, she apologized again. This time there were no excuses. She said she had been stressed and had taken it out on me. She admitted the phrase, "too much trouble," was cruel. She said she understood why I had been hurt. I thanked her. Then I told her something I had learned from the whole experience. People usually discover how much someone matters when they suddenly need what that person was quietly giving them. She nodded. The landlord's call had been dramatic, but the real lesson wasn't about property. It was about value. People sometimes become careless with those they assume will always be available. Parents, grandparents, siblings, old friends. We can become part of the background of someone's life. Our patience is expected. Our forgiveness is assumed. Our presence is treated as optional. Until suddenly it isn't. I never wanted my son or daughter-in-law to suffer. I never wanted them frightened about their home. But I'm grateful that the situation forced all of us to confront what had happened. They learned that respect cannot disappear when it becomes inconvenient. My son learned that avoiding a difficult conversation can be its own form of betrayal. And I learned something too. I learned not to chase invitations. If someone wants me in their life, they should make room for me with sincerity, not obligation. I learned that dignity doesn't require shouting. Sometimes the strongest response to disrespect is simply to stop making yourself endlessly available. Most importantly, I learned that being needed is not the same as being valued. When my daughter-in-law called me, too much trouble, I felt small. When the landlord called me, circumstances suddenly made me important again. But I didn't want my worth to depend on either of those moments. My worth had never changed. Only their perception had. That was the part I finally understood. Family relationships survive not because people never make mistakes, but because they take responsibility when they do. They survive when apologies become changed behavior, when boundaries are respected, and when love is treated as something worth protecting. The visit that was cancelled ended up teaching me more than the visit itself ever could have. And the unexpected phone call from the landlord, that simply made sure nobody could ignore the lesson.